Hello, this is Vince, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about an issue that is very near and dear to your hearts if, you're in the right place. But a lot of times in my first year of supervising master's theses, I tended to notice I was having a lot of the same conversations, seeing the same mistakes, and pointing out the same potential solutions and things like that. And so I thought I'd make a video kind of outlining some of these common mistakes. So I grew up in a kind of a church environment, and so in Christian ideology or whatever, or even other religious settings, you talk about sin, right? Sin is unavoidable. Sin is a thing that can either be something that you do that you shouldn't, or something that you don't do that you should. And well, while we all strive to avoid sin, according to the lore of the religion, we can't be completely free of it, and that's okay. But in writing a thesis, there are a few things that I consider sins. They are avoidable, but sometimes inevitable, and there will never be a perfect thesis. But I will point out a few sins that we can look out for in order for us to avoid them or correct them. I want to point out that there is a document that I will provide that provides a lot more detail, and you can also use as a reference or even just use instead of this video to take a look at your leisure, and also use as a basis for asking questions or just a helpful guide for you in general. And so here are my sins of writing a thesis. So the first big sin that I consider is a very all-encompassing general sin known as just not knowing what you're doing. Now, of course, in the remaining sins, this will be more specific, but when it comes to not knowing what you're doing, it comes off in pretty much any way where you have it's more of a vibe than it really is like a specific bit. Oftentimes, if you don't know what you're doing, you'll kind of write something and naturally you'll be very uncomfortable with it. And the experience of your coach will be very much, they will read it and they won't understand it completely, and then they'll question their understanding. And the feedback will be very much general. Hey, like, don't really know what you're doing here. Be more organized. And so if you aren't organized in your mind, it will come out on paper. And if you make it to the defense, not knowing what you're doing, it will be very obvious because you will be asked a question and you will struggle to answer it. But of course, with this general sin, I can't give specific advice. So let's get into more specific sins so we can have a better insight on what we can do about it. So the second sin is not properly motivating your hypotheses, or in many cases, not motivating them at all. I oftentimes see a lot of students make a very common mistake, which is they might say something like, we expect CEO risk aversion to increase the probability of paying a dividend. And so what will happen is they will usually try to justify it in the sense of, they'll say, past research has shown this positive relationship, so we anticipate this positive relationship. And they don't really explain what this relationship means, why it's important, or what makes it different. Like what is the consensus in the previous literature, but like, what are you adding? And so when I think about putting together a hypothesis or formulating a hypothesis, there are three really important points that you need to cover. And this is not exhaustive, but these are three big things that I personally will notice and touch on if I'm your coach. The first is, why is your hypothesized relationship important? Now that could be not necessarily the relationship itself, but it could be, okay, why is CEO risk aversion relevant in finance research? Why is the probability of a dividend payment important just in isolation? And why is it perhaps important that they would be connected? The second piece of information I would like you to incorporate in motivating your hypothesis would be, why should we expect these two things to be related? Because we can say, okay, like, we've seen out there that these things are related, but like, that's not enough. You can't just say, oh, someone said it and we're good. Like, it's got to be related somehow. You need to really explain, and you're going to hear a lot of coaches mention this, the mechanism, exactly what is happening that leads, in this case, CEO risk aversion to specifically impact probability of a dividend. And the third piece of information, if necessary, is how is your study different from similar studies if similar studies have been done? Because again, a very common mistake people do is they'll say, other studies find a positive relation, so I should find one too. But then that essentially is saying, okay, well, you're not really contributing anything. And so it might be something like you have a different time period. It might be that you have a different methodology. But there are also, we can get into like the details, but I'll leave that for the document because there are good distinctions and bad distinctions. If you just say they do it in the 90s, we do it in the 2010s, so we're different somehow, like that's not enough. You're going to need to give more. And so speaking of giving more, that actually puts us into our next sin, not being specific. And so not being specific, it's difficult to really be specific on what we mean by not being specific because it's very self-explanatory. For example, in the previous example, of course, if you have a new environment or a new scene or a new setting, say a previous study did it in the 90s, we're doing it in the 2010s, what does that mean? Like, why? You have to elaborate a bit more on why that is important. Is there a particular legal change? Was there some sort of overall market environment shift? Has there been some shock to completely separate those two periods? Why is it that your different setting is important? It could also be something like one common thing I see for some students is they claim, okay, well, interestingly enough, my study is important because it has not been studied in the past, or for some reason, the relationship between CEO risk aversion and dividend payout hasn't been tested at all. So, of course, that's a good reason to study it if it hasn't been studied. But at the same time, if it hasn't been studied, there's probably a good reason why it hasn't been studied. So make sure that you communicate to your audience and also to yourself that you understand why it hasn't been, or at least have some idea. Is it a data limitation? Is it that this relationship is captured in another context? Or is it something that just otherwise makes this research idea completely infeasible or irrelevant? But say I give a few more examples and descriptions of why they may be problematic and how they can be fixed in the supporting document. Now, in the next sin is not justifying every decision you make. I personally like this because, for example, it's my job to essentially pick apart a thesis. It makes me look good to make you look bad. I'm just going to be honest. That's my job. As a coach on your defense, you are meant to defend. And the way I'm going to attack is to ask you why. Why did you do what you did? And again, you have to defend your decision. But the thing is, if you don't defend your decision in your thesis, you're not going to be able to defend your decision when you need to in your defense when you have a coach and co-reader hounding you as to why you did a particular thing. Now that's a pretty straightforward rule, but I do want to give a few specific examples of things that I see very frequently that students struggle to justify, or at least two particular details in this point that students struggle with. The first is when it comes to fixed effects. So with fixed effects, what a lot of papers do is they'll specify we do firm fixed effects, and then most of the time they don't say why. They might just describe it in the table description and then never explain it. Or it's very unusual to see a paper, at least in my experience, explain their decision for fixed effects. Because in professional world or finance academics, I guess it's common knowledge, right? But for you as a master's student, it's not common knowledge. So understandably, it's difficult to figure out. And so a lot of times people just skip it. Like they'll follow past literature. They'll do maybe a proper fixed effect and then not be able to explain it in the defense. But that does lead to the second common issue in this kind of sin area, which is a lot of students correctly refer to past research to justify their decision, which is good. I always tell students, if you're thinking about what controls to use, if you're thinking about what fixed effects to use, always just look at past research and see what they do and pretty much just do what they did. So that's fine. You are doing what is more likely a correct method, but that's not the entire purpose. When you're defending, you also need to show that you understand what you're doing. So yes, you can follow prior literature to make a decision on fixed effects, but you still need to understand, well, why did past literature do that fixed effect? You can't just say, I follow what they did, I don't get it, but it works, and just wrap it up. That won't look good, and you will get docked for that. Another sin that students tend to struggle with that is a bit more complicated to solve is not considering alternative explanations. This is especially problematic when I see it in bachelor projects. A lot of times it will be, hey, X leads to Y, and so X causes Y. And that brings up the common saying, correlation does not equal causation. I assume that most students who commit this sin are actually aware of this. This isn't like blindly just out of nowhere, no one knows, like, oh, it doesn't mean causation, what the hell? But the thing is, you definitely need to kind of explain what other alternatives are there. Because, well, you could argue that, oh, you're providing counter arguments, you're weakening your argument, but that's not particularly the case. What it would be is, okay, this person is being honest and they thought about the inference of their result. This essentially is one of the few areas where I believe that you can apply creativity. Like, let's say that you have a negative relationship between CEO equity compensation and dividend payout. Now, at the bare minimum, you'll say that CEO equity compensation is associated with lower dividend payout, all right? But of course, that doesn't mean that it causes lower dividend payout. Now, a few alternative explanations I can think of are things like firms with high dividend payout tend to have less cash to waste, so that may be a mechanism to reduce agency costs. And so if they're paying dividends to reduce agency costs, then such firms may not feel the need to provide equity compensation to do the same thing. Or it could also be that high dividend payout is associated with, or it tends to be a characteristic of mature firms, and mature firms may also be less likely to provide equity compensation. And so that might not be that the equity compensation causes dividends, but it might just be that those are both characteristics of mature firms. Now, at the bare minimum, it's important to just acknowledge it. You don't have to solve it, but it's important to acknowledge these alternatives. And that also kind of leads into this discussion of endogeneity. And so endogeneity is a thing that is the biggest headache in finance research. And again, it's not required for you to solve it, because this is why finance papers take years to make and why it's such a headache to publish these things. But at the very least, show that you thought about it and try to explain as much as you can of where it comes from, how you could test it, and best case scenario, explain how to test it or why whether it's feasible or whether it's not feasible. But I'm not going to go into the endogeneity discussion here because there are so many things that talk about there's so much endogeneity, and it's a whirlwind. But in the file that I provide, I do go over a very brief description of it and provide an article as an example of discussing the econometric characteristics of endogeneity. The next sin is more of a practical piece. It's not really a conceptual piece. It's pasting and paraphrasing. It leads to what I call accidental plagiarism, and this is extremely common, especially for bachelor students, but I've seen it and actually had to fail a master's student for this. I understand that most master's students do not, or most students in general don't go out of their way to just maliciously plagiarize and not cite things and claim things as their own. With pasting and paraphrasing, some students even cite the paper. However, many coaches will take issue if you simply just copy and paste an entire paragraph, change a few words around, even if you do cite the paper. And so the thing is, it also leads to a lot of students being anxious or scared to try to describe something using another source because they feel like they'll get docked for plagiarism. So I kind of want to, there's definitely two realms. There's two realms in which this pacing and paraphrasing is a problem. The first is if one just as I mentioned, just copies and pastes and then changes the words around. So if the student cites the paper, it's still an issue. And the big problem with this is if you're just sending your draft for feedback, your coach probably won't catch it because they're not reading every single citation that you write. They're not going to go into all the papers and check. When you submit an official submission, it will have this turn it in framework where they will check other sources. And so if you turn in an official document, that's when you'll get caught. And so it is very easy to tell if someone just copy pasted and switched the words around. Now, even if they don't just copy and paste and switch the words around, there is still a second angle. It could be that you don't copy paste, but you do struggle to understand the concept that you're pulling from another paper. So when you try to write it in your own words, the wording still closely mirrors that of the original document. And so this again is due to a lack of understanding. And so taking from the sin number 4 as well, it makes it extra important that anything you include in your thesis, you need to understand it. You can't just throw it in there thinking, oh, this makes sense, like it supports my argument. The reader will understand it because I don't. Because if you don't understand it, again, you'll probably be talked to about it in the defense and you'll, to be honest, embarrass yourself. Or it will sound too similar to another work and then you might be questioned on whether or not you plagiarized. So essentially, in order to avoid accidental plagiarism, never just copy paste, even if you do cite the paper. And if you are going to take an idea from another paper, make sure you understand that idea well enough to describe it in your own words. The next sin is not checking your data. So this is a big thing especially because a lot of students are never really taught much about data. And a lot of times when you have complicated data sets, it looks scary and messy and you're like, how am I even supposed to look at this? What do I do? And so I agree with you. You should not just be combing your data set randomly, hoping to find something weird. That's not how that works. Now, of course, if you're more senior at this, you'll kind of already have a feel for what to look for. But I'm just going to say, like, here are a few red flags that I look out for and a few possible reasons why these are happening. So a few red flags that I personally look for are the following. So I'll look at your summary statistics and your regression tables because these are just visual. They're very easy to see. So first thing is, if I look at your summary stats and you list how many observations your variables have, and then you run regressions with those variables, and there is like a significant drop in number of observations. It might be like if you have 5,000 observations and then you're down to like 3,000. That would be like, okay, well, what's going on here? Another one would be very low R squared. Now I'm thinking like below 5%. Of course, there are some niche topics, such as if you do CEO risk aversion and probability of a dividend. No, that one, but if you do something like very niche with very messy data, you may see a pretty low R squared and that might be proper. But if I see a low R squared, that would lead me to say, okay, well, similar papers, what's their R squared? And so if it is much lower than similar papers, then that is a problem. And of course, very high T values. Now we're talking like 50, 60, 70 or more, or even over 100 in some cases. Now, of course, you could have this God tier 10 out of 10 thesis, super great idea with a perfect relationship that no one ever thought of before, but it's much more likely that there's something wrong with your data. And so just want to say that these red flags, they're not necessarily meaning that there is a problem, but what it does mean is that you need to look at your data to verify that there is not a problem. When it comes to these red flags, in my experience, the culprits are usually one of two things, either duplicates or missing data. Now, duplicate data usually comes from, at least in large masses that affect your standard errors and t-values, is if you're doing something like merging two data sets that are at different levels. As in, you might be merging daily stock data with annual firm data. And then, for example, that annual firm data, that like 2012, Apple's total assets was 1 million, let's say. Well, if you're merging that with daily data, then now you have 300 and 200 or 300 observations of Apple in 2012 with 1 million in assets. And so you need to be very careful on how you run regressions and how you formulate that data set, because if you have two or 300 duplicates for a single firm year, that's going to drastically reduce the standard error and give you those gigantic t-values. Now, when it comes to missing data issues, Stata is pretty good at notifying you when things become missing, but there are a few common practices that lead to a lot of missing data that are problematic. The first one is if you run a regression, you have a bunch of controls, and one of those controls has a bunch of missing values, it's not going to use any of those observations. If you have a regression where at least one variable has a missing value, it will not include that observation in the regression. And so checking your data, you might see something like, okay, we have this one variable that has a bunch of values that are there, but then, like, let's say we have variable 1 and variable 2. So variable 1 has a bunch of missing data, but also a bunch of data, right? And we see variable 2 is the same, except for some reason, in many cases, where variable 1 has data, variable 2 is missing, and vice versa. And now it's going to be very context specific how to address that problem, but that is something that you will need to look out for. But the second one is actually self-caused, taking the natural logarithm of a negative value. This is very common when students mistakenly take the log of stock return, or students take the log of return on assets, as net income can be negative, and you're supposed to do 1 plus return, not just return. And so if you are taking the natural log, make sure you understand the distribution of your variables that you're doing that with, so you don't run into that pitfall of deleting half of your sample. Now, the next sin that is actually something that's very relevant to me, but again, very, very context specific, is not acknowledging contradictions. And so this is more of a matter of ignoring complications that are hard to fix. For example, I'll just use a very simple example, or a very common example in my field is a lot of students, they do a good job at trying to be transparent. And so they'll use multiple dependent variables. They'll use Tobin's Q and ROA, both as measures of firm performance. However, in many cases, their key variable will have a positive relationship with Tobin's Q, but a negative relationship with ROA. And so the problem is not that there's a contradiction. The problem is you see a contradiction, it's very clear, but you don't do anything about it. That's the big sin. Now, I'm going to say, and the document also lists this, but I'm going to say there are a few different ways, or I guess what I call tiers of how to handle this problem. So the absolute least that you can do other than ignoring the contradiction is just acknowledge it. You can just say, hey, this is contradictory. It'll, at the very least, just show that you understand your own table. And so it won't be that, but it still doesn't look good because then it looks lazy that you're not going beyond that. Now, the next kind of higher tier up would be, okay, you acknowledge this contradiction and then you describe why it might exist, but you don't really describe how to test it or any of that. But then you could go a step further and describe, here's how I would test whether my explanation for this discrepancy is true or valid. And so when you describe this test, then again, the next step you can take is, okay, either your test is feasible or it's not. If it's not feasible, totally cool. Just explain why it's not feasible. Is it a data limitation? Is it a really complicated mathematical thing that hasn't really been created yet? What's going on? But if it is feasible, then do it. Now, the problem is some people don't, and that leads to the next sin: proposing doable solutions and not attempting them. Now, this one, like the previous sin, is one that is because of inaction. It is one that does not look good if you commit, because it essentially is just coming off as here's this thing right in front of you that you just aren't doing. You explain how to do it according to the reader. It's very simple. I had a student who put in their limitations, if only we had a dividend payout variable. It's yeah, you do. It's CompuStat. You've used CompuStat. It's there. And so if you find yourself in this situation, just be honest. If they ask why you didn't do it, just be honest. I didn't think of it. Or you can be self-incriminating, lazy, whatever you want to say, as long as it's honest. Because if you try to cover yourself and try to make up an excuse, it's going to be awkward. It's not going to look good. So if you propose a doable solution, do it, please. The next sin is one that it's pretty general, and it's one of those that you don't really feel the need to do. But for me, when I read a paper, I think that those who commit this sin are missing out on good opportunities. And that sin is not experimenting. So a lot of students feel a lot of anxiety about certain little decisions in their regressions, such as, do I use firm fixed effects or industry fixed effects? Do I define a high research and development variable as greater than the industry median or greater than 40% or something like that? And my answer to these questions is do both. What happens when you change the threshold of your variable? What happens when you use different fixed effects? That helps you understand your data better, helps you understand your result better. And at the very least, you can then put a little footnote and say, I tested it with this other thing and the results were the same. And so then that makes the reader more comfortable that you did go out of your way to check a little bit to make sure it wasn't just, data snooping, just throwing stuff around until something works and sticking with that thing that works. It comes off as very honest when you do test other things and leave a footnote, in my view. So I do recommend that if you have multiple different ways to measure something or test something, do it in all the ways that you think of. Why not, right? And now the last sin is not requesting targeted feedback. A very common mistake, and this may be because the coach doesn't explain their expectations properly. I know I didn't because my first year, But the one thing that I recommend that you don't do is don't do one of these two things. Don't not ask for feedback, and don't just send a draft and say, hey, give me feedback. Those two will the first one will get you literally nothing. The second one will it'll essentially take a lot of your coach's time, and the feedback quality won't be very good. And so that's just going to be like a wasted opportunity. And so essentially, because if the coach has like 20 or more theses like myself to read in like a week or two's time, they're not going to read through the whole thing and give you line for line comments. And so what I strongly recommend you do, and of course this varies from coach to coach, and you can discuss this with your coach to see what they prefer. I strongly recommend that. But in general, at least for me, I strongly recommend probably both of these things. First is ask for like targeted feedback. So ask like, are my hypotheses well motivated? Did I do this Fama-Macbeth relationship correctly? Should I be using an instrumental variable here? Well, the answer to that is usually no, but that's a whole nother thing. But the second one, and this was one that I've actually only experienced in my bachelor, was for each draft submission, I would recommend you provide like some detail on what changed. You don't have to go and write an entire essay on like every detail of the detail. Just say, okay, I changed, I added table 7, I changed some of the description for my data collection, I added some points in my hypothesis development for hypothesis 2, and that's what I changed. Those are the sins of writing a thesis that I experienced, and hopefully this can save you some time. But of course, if you have any questions on these sins or want to suggest additional sins, feel free to contact me if you are part of the university, or leave a comment below. Again, thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful rest of your day.